All right. So today's talk is about anthromes. And you should have met with your partner and discussed these four objectives. So you should have read the Ellis and Ramankutty article and then discussed these four objectives. So hopefully you feel like you have a good sense of what the article is about. And the point of this is to clarify any potential points of confusion and really highlight some of the key themes. So first, in order to understand anthromes, we need to think about biomes, right? So biomes are an ecological concept whereby the different regions of the world are characterized by certain vegetation, plant structures, and then associated fauna. So basically plant and animal life that would be associated and adapted to a particular climate. And these biomes are going to be determined by these factors. So biomes are traditionally determined by annual precipitation and, I'm not sure if you guys see this, but I need to kind of move this out of the way. Okay, so by annual precipitation and annual average temperature, right? And so we have, for example, a subtropical desert would be a warm desert that does not have very much precipitation, right? A tropical rainforest being an area with high annual precipitation and a high average temperature. And then at the other extreme, we have our tundra, which is cold and dry, okay? And so you could have a tundra in the Arctic, you could have a tundra in the Antarctic, but you would not find the same kind of, necessarily the same kind of animal life in both places, plant and animal life and vegetation. But you would potentially expect that a plant could move from a tundra in one location to a tundra in another location and adapt fairly well. This is one of the things that we've seen with species as they move around the globe, and particularly species that are well adapted in one area that move into another area, and sometimes they become invasive species because they're able to thrive in a similar climate and just going back here real quickly. Oops, my little clicker's not working. Going back here really quickly, note that this is primarily, these climate patterns are going to be primarily determined by distance from the equator. So the equator getting the most direct solar radiation on the Earth. And also your rainfall patterns, which is really has to do with the ocean circulation patterns and the rotation of the Earth. Rainfall patterns are pretty complicated to model, as anybody who's ever tried to follow climate would know. And then also your elevation, right? So here, for example, you have a mountain range that's going to be impacting the surrounding potential biomes. So what is an anthrome? How does this differ from the concept of biomes? First of all, I should mention that the lead author on that paper is an ecologist. And so really the point that he is trying to make about this study that they did is that we should not be thinking in terms of biomes anymore, but rather we should be identifying these anthromes on the planet. Anthromes being these ideas that there's sustained human interaction with the biosphere in certain ways, and that understanding these interactions can help us to understand the Anthropocene overall, and potentially help mitigate human footprints on the planet. Okay, so how did they do this? Actually, I'm going to go back to this last slide for just a minute. Looking at this slide, right, this is a very coarse satellite, I believe this is a satellite image of the planet. And so as you all know, there are satellites circulating the planet, taking data from the planet. They're also doing things like keeping your cell phones working, but they're actually recording data that is reflected off the surface of the planet. So that could be heat data, it could be light data. In the case of these satellite images, that would be light data that they're recording. So essentially able to capture images of the planet. And these images can translate to pixels, right? So the pixel is the size of the smallest unit, right, of that visual data. And those pixels can be analyzed to understand patterns of land cover and land use on the surface of the planet. And so this is pretty foundational to the topic of remote sensing. Remote sensing is essentially using these remotely sensed data to analyze patterns on the planet. It can be used to analyze all kinds of different patterns, but is very commonly used to understand land cover and land use, right? So what is the cover of vegetation look like on the planet? And what can we infer about the human uses of that land based on the land cover? Okay, so what they did, what you're looking at here, I'm gonna pull up the, what you're looking at here is the model that they used, presumably an ArcMap. I believe that was the program that they used for this, by which for each pixel, they're basically running the pixel through a flow chart. So, you know, if the density is above a threshold, it gets classified as an urban cell. If it's below that threshold, it gets classified as a non-urban cell. And then it would continue to go through all of these different classifications until finally you run them through a cluster analysis where it puts them kind of in similar categories together. So pixels that have a similar output from this model. So the output is going to give you some sort of numerical range probably, and they'll cluster them together so that you can come up with subcategories that are, if you looked at every single pixel as a separate category, you would have, you know, billions of these pixels on the surface of the planet. So instead, this cluster analysis groups similar pixels together so that you can come up with these 18 anthrome and 3 wild clusters that they came up with in the end. So what did they come up with? Oh, this is just kind of a summary, visual summary of what I showed you on the last page. That was a little bit more of the data, the diving into their supplementary data to really show you kind of how the model was built. But this is just a visual, kind of a more, if you're not familiar with modeling, it would be perhaps a little bit more intuitive to think about what they did. Okay, so primarily they looked at population, what they could infer from land use. So that would be looking at things like crops, and then just more general land cover, density of forest, and other types of detectable vegetation. And they came up with this map. If I'm not mistaken, I have it hyperlinked. Let's see if I can stop that. Yeah. So see how if you were to click on this, on the slides that you have, this will bring you to this website that just got popped up. And you can actually play around with the map. It's pretty interesting. You can zoom in on certain areas. And so this is how they're mapping out where these anthropogenic biomes of the world, or anthromes, are. And essentially, we have our wild lands that could be either barren or more forested, right? And then you have this kind of variation in these uses, but also the intensity of the uses. And I have some pictures at the end that you've probably, hopefully already looked through that will help sort of clarify that point. And then also here, so we have our urban areas that they've dissected into dense urban and or dense and less dense urban areas, right? Okay, so these are the different categories that they have, right? So a little description of each, of how they came up with those categories. And then here, what you're seeing is a distribution of those categories on the planet. And actually, in your reading, it's a little bit easier to see this because it's all on one page. I'm going to point out here that this completely, I've taught this article a million times and I'd never noticed this before. It's completely bizarre to me that they have North America and then Latin America. And I dove into the article and tried to find it where they're making that division, and it wasn't clear. So I'd have to look into some of their data. But as I hope we all know, Latin America typically would be considered to incorporate Mexico, and Mexico is part of North America. So not entirely sure. I couldn't find how they did that division. I would guess that it was maybe a little bit of sloppiness, and they were actually talking about this as Central America and South America in the Caribbean. But again, some of the things I saw, it was a little confusing. So I want to point that out just because of the importance of being geographically accurate. And again, I'm sure they have their reasons in there, but I couldn't find what those were. Okay, so this is generally the distribution across the world, right? So these would be our wildlands across the world. What percent is still wild? And then these would be some level of human populated anthromes, right? So at some point in the article, they say that over 75% of ice-free surface is human populated, which is, again, a little bit going to be a factor of how they chose the unit of analysis. So they were able to work with, just because they're trying to calculate the entire globe, they worked with what's called 5 arc minute. They translate that to a degree, but basically it's a degree of the rotation around the Earth. But it's pretty big. They're pretty big pixels that they were working with. So you are going to lose some of the variation in there. You're going to lose some of the ways that you're not going to get a perfectly accurate number, but it's certainly a very good estimate, particularly trying to consider the globe at once. So here's what we're seeing in North America, right? You have a little bit more, in Australia and New Zealand, sorry, or you have a little bit more of these wildlands. Presumably, quite a bit of barren land. Presumably a lot of this would be up in the Arctic, right? The most northern North America regions. And then, you know, by comparison, let's choose this one, right? You can see a little bit more in Europe. There's a little bit more wild that would not be barren. And a little bit more of those forested areas, right? So you can just sort of compare by, these aren't continents, by regions, what are the different makeup of those anthropogenic biomes. Okay, so this is an important conceptual model, and this is where we're going to dive into some of that objective 4, which talked about human appropriation of net primary production. So before even diving into this figure, I'm going to define this term for you, net primary production. This was in the reading, I'm 90% sure, but the concept is that it is, so plants and any photosynthesizing organism makes its own sugar from typically water and sunlight and some other nutrients, right? And those plants don't just make them for the food chain, they actually make them so that they can survive, and they consume those sugars throughout their life cycle. So the primary production would be all of the sugars that are produced by these photosynthesizing organisms on the planet or in a certain region. The net primary production is what they produce minus what they use to stay alive. So if you just look out at vegetation, it's pretty clear that they produce a lot more sugar than they use, and that sugar feeds the entire food chain, right? From our pollinators up to us who eat vegetables, the vegetables we feed to livestock, which then we eat the livestock, right? So that is how our entire food chain is powered. And when we talk about this term, human appropriation of net primary production, that is how much humans have appropriated or taken ownership of that net primary production. So how much of it are we using compared to how much is left for other species on the planet? And that will become a bit more important when we talk about later on in the semester or in the summer, we're going to talk about biodiversity loss and habitat loss. Okay, so conceptually, what they're trying to get us to understand is that wildlands are going to have these associated factors, right? This is how they're determining them, but this is what we might think about, and this is actually going to continue on another slide. This is what we might think about in terms of the ecosystem services or the benefits that we get from those, or benefits or detriments that we get from that system, right? So if you have a wildland, you're going to have a lot of biodiversity. You're going to have pretty good net primary production if you have trees and other, if it's not bare. And you're going to have a net carbon sink. So it's going to absorb more carbon than it's going to put out. And then at the kind of other extreme, we have our urban dense settlements, right? So we have, these are sort of how we understand what they're made up of. We're going to have a kind of mid-range net primary production, depending on the construct of that urban area. And then you're going to have a net carbon emissions, right? You won't have any carbon sinks in those areas, and you're going to have a lot of reactive nitrogen, which one of our next topics is going to be the nitrogen cycle, so it will make more sense to you what reactive nitrogen is. Okay, and then there's these kind of in between different potential anthromes, right? We have our forested anthrome, rangelands, croplands, and villages, and we should be thinking about, sort of their argument, the different ways in which human impacts, right? So these are different variables that we're measuring in those planetary boundaries, right? The biogeochemical cycles are going to be measuring some nitrogen. We have a biodiversity or a biosphere integrity boundary. So the different ways these anthromes are going to impact planetary boundaries. And then here is the bottom half of that figure. So you can look at other things as well, such as land use, land cover, and that net primary production a little bit more specifically. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Again, reiterating their main point that they believe that this is a new framework for how we should be thinking about ecology and earth science. So get rid of the idea that we should just be thinking about this vegetation and flora and fauna as characteristic of certain biomes, but rather we should be thinking about these anthromes, so human presence on the planet. A few statistics that were in that article: only 22% of land and 11% of net primary production are wild. More than 75% of ice-free land shows alteration as a result of human residence and land use. And more than 80% of people live in these urban and densely populated village anthromes. Okay, so in the last, or in a former lecture, we looked at human population and how more of the population is moving into urban areas, and we're at about 50% of the world population living in urban areas. But if we consider also these densely populated village anthromes, we move that up to 80%. So that's pretty high. And then just these take-home points, right? That we don't think of, you know, that nature, that really human interactions with the biosphere are beyond a single dimension of impact. So it's a whole new way of conceptualizing how we're thinking about human presence on the planet. Okay, and these final slides are just showing you some pictures of what these places might look like. So we have wildlands. This would be a barren wildland, and this is a more forested wildland. This is a populated forest. So if you look over here, you can see, you know, some population surrounding this forested area. And then we have our rangelands. Right, so these are remote rangelands. If any of you spend a bit of time out west, you have miles and miles of these remote rangelands. And this would be a more populated rangeland, right? Smaller rangeland area, a settlement back here. And then croplands. So remote croplands, again, a lot of these we have in huge swaths of the United States. And then this rain-fed mosaic, where you have these tree buffers, right, separating these smaller plots, less sort of, if you look back here, you can see the obvious irrigation structure, right? This is claiming to be rain-fed, so potentially lower role of irrigation. And then finally, our villages, so a rain-fed mosaic of a village, and then here's a picture of a rice village. And then finally, a highly populated urban area, and then just a more dense urban settlement according to the terminology that they are using. All right, so hopefully this clarified the article, and any questions, send them my way.